Sooner the better.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. I'm Lena Metlege Diab, the Member of Parliament for Halifax West, and I'm pleased this evening to be the MC for today's event. I just want to start by acknowledging that we are gathered here today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Et j'aimerais rendre hommage à tous les peuples autochtones.
And I would like to render homage to all the Indigenous peoples.
Begin by acknowledging everybody who's here with us today, and I'm not going to name them now because I will name them as each one of them comes speak, just for timing purposes. But thank you very much for everybody that's here with us. As we all know, the federal government has set an ambitious climate plan aimed at creating a stronger economy and more sustainable jobs. We know that to reduce the effects of climate change, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Parce que la lutte contre le changement climatique.
Because the fight against climate change and creating well-paid jobs and strengthening our economy all has to be pursued in parallel.
That is a diverse country filled with immense economic opportunities in renewable energy development and resources that differ from coast to coast to coast. I think of the astounding potential of wind and offshore renewables in my own province of Nova Scotia, potential that we're going to unlock through Bill C-49. If we are serious about meeting our climate commitments and getting Canada to net zero emissions within the next 3 decades, we need a plan for each and every region of Canada. So today, both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have shown immense progress in achieving their off-coal by 2030 commitments, along with comprehensive plans which highlight the unique economic potential of both regions in renewable energy development. C'est en travaillant ensemble avec tous les niveaux.
It's by working together at all levels of government and Indigenous partners and industry that we will create a clean and prosperous economy for all.
To speak more about how our governments are working together to build a cleaner, more prosperous future for Atlantic Canada, I'm pleased to introduce the first speaker, and that's Minister Wilkinson. The floor is yours. You can tell them how tight we are on time. So.
Thank you for that introduction. Good evening. We are going to endeavor to keep the speaking relatively short. Premier Higgs needs to catch an airplane and certainly want to have an opportunity to try to answer folks' questions. Certainly very happy to welcome Premiers Houston and Higgs to Ottawa to discuss our mutual interest in phasing out coal-fired power generation and advancing plans to ensure a clean, reliable, and affordable grid becomes a reality for Nova Scotians and New Brunswickers going forward. Au printemps dernier, le régulateur.
Last spring, the Canada Energy Regulator published a report in which it stated that for a net zero Canada, power generation would have to more than double between 2021 and 2050. And many authors have come out with similar comments.
Capacity is one of the challenges faced by provinces and territories across this country. However, as we move forward, the types of generation certainly increasingly matters. As the world moves towards a net zero future, we must decarbonize our electricity grids to eliminate emissions from existing generation, yes, but also to enable electrification and drive emissions reductions in transportations, buildings, industrial processes, and more. Clean, abundant, reliable, and affordable power is going to increasingly underpin industrial and economic competitiveness. Those countries and jurisdictions that move thoughtfully and boldly to address decarbonization and the expansion of electricity grids have the opportunity to lead economically in new areas of growth, such as hydrogen, critical minerals, biofuels, and clean technologies, including small modular reactors. One example of this was highlighted quite strongly in the report that the Public Policy Forum released just today, which underlined that just one of the proposed sites for offshore wind off the coast of Nova Scotia has the potential to support 1,000 15-megawatt turbines, which would power about 6.5 million homes. That would create about 30,000 direct jobs annually during construction and about 1,200 permanent, well-paying jobs, which is, as a side note, I will say, underlines why it's so important that we move C-49 through the House. And certainly, New Brunswick has similar opportunities in areas such as small modular reactors. Dans la course mondiale vers la carboneutralité d'ici 2030.
In this global race towards net zero by 2050, an electricity grid that can power our homes, businesses, industries in our country with clean, reliable and affordable energy is a real must for the environment and the economy.
Premiers Houston and Higgs understand the importance of moving away from coal-fired power and the importance of thinking forward as to how they can design and build electricity grids that will drive economic opportunity in their provinces. While electricity is indeed an area of provincial jurisdiction, this federal government is keen to support provinces and territories that are aiming to move forward strongly to succeed. It is in this context that we met today to discuss how we can establish a framework and a more active process for collaboration on these critical issues. I am pleased to say that today we finalized a joint policy statement through which Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick will advance 2 tracks of collaborative work to support the phase-out of coal-fired electricity by 2030 and drive to net zero electricity by 2035 on the road to net zero by 2050. It is an important policy statement that is focused, yes, on achieving important environmental outcomes, but as importantly, it is a framework aimed at enabling economic success. Dans le cadre du premier volet, nous avons convenu de travailler ensemble.
Within the first track, we've agreed to work together to successfully implement the plans developed by each of the provinces to phase out coal by 2030 and build a clean, robust electricity grid for the future. The federal government is committed to bring to the table the financial instruments that are required to support the province's plans.
By working together in a number of priority areas, including the expansion of wind and solar, including the development of offshore wind resources, batteries and renewables integration, the introduction of hydrogen-capable flex-fuel fast-start generation, biomass energy, small modular reactors, and importantly, building the Salisbury-Onslow transmission line, connecting Nova Scotia and New Brunswick to the first phase of a modified Atlantic loop. And underlining our commitment to work in collaboration, I am pleased to announce today a number of federal investments that build on investments previously made to support clean energy activity in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. These include $11.5 million for Nova Scotia to enable improvement in grid system monitoring and automation, $7 million to support pre-development work for the ARC small modular reactor at Point Lepreau in New Brunswick, $2 million in federal funding to explore the feasibility of converting the Belledune coal-fired generating station, New Brunswick's last coal plant, from coal to sustainably sourced biomass, and an investment of approximately $1 million to assist the Belledune Port Authority to undertake site preparedness studies to establish a green industrial hub. These investments represent a step forward in the collaborative work that we will do together. Under the second track of work that was discussed today, we will be advancing additional areas of critical importance and cooperation on the path to net zero by 2035. This includes through things like continued advancement of small modular reactors for New Brunswick and offshore wind for Nova Scotia, and the exploration of regional transmission and energy exchange opportunities in partnership with neighboring utilities in Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Prince Edward Island. Cela passe notamment par la poursuite du développement.
This includes pursuing the development of small modular reactors in New Brunswick and offshore wind energy in Nova Scotia, as well as exploring regional transmission and energy exchange opportunities in partnership with neighbouring utilities in Quebec, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Prince Edward Island.
I say that I truly believe that Canada works best when Canadians work together. In a federation like ours, where responsibilities are distributed and where regions are so different from resource and economic perspectives, active effort to find pathways for effective collaboration is extremely important. What we are announcing today is, I think, a great example of how we can indeed accelerate and realize significant progress when we commit to working together. Our governments share a number of key common goals to address the urgent challenge we face from climate change and to build a clean economy underpinned by a net zero grid that will deliver jobs and economic opportunity for our citizens. I certainly want to thank Premiers Houston and Higgs for coming to Ottawa today for these discussions, and I thank them very much for their collaboration and partnership now and moving forward. Thank you very much for joining us today.
So Canada's Minister of Energy and Natural Resources, the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson. Thank you very much. I did not announce that earlier, so I need to do that now. I'm now going to turn the floor over to the Premier of New Brunswick, the Honourable Blaine Higgs.
Thank you very much. Bonjour à tout le monde. It has been
Good afternoon.
a discussion today, and certainly I appreciate the alignment of purpose with the federal government on where we want to go, where our targets need to be, and what we're all trying to collectively achieve. I think that, you know, some key factors that bode into the discussions will be around affordability for taxpayers in every aspect of our development. And that was a common theme certainly throughout our meeting, that we have to find a way that people can afford to live and work in our respective provinces. And so that plays a role in timing, it plays a role in investments and how we move forward. I think that when we look at a sense of urgency, the timing certainly provides that. We need to find a way to meet the targets as outlined, but again, do it in a manner that people can accept. So diversity of supply, we're about 80% now renewable in the province, but we have some facilities that they're due for certainly a rebuild, and that Mactaquac would be an example of that, a major hydro dam for us. And so we have some existing large expenses to already put into the mix of all of this. So energy security becomes paramount for all of us, and I'm certainly proud to work with the federal government, but also with my Nova Scotian colleague as we look for better connections between us that ultimately give us better export capabilities throughout the world as we develop wind resources, as we develop SMRs, and certainly I feel that in many ways the future depends on some major sources of clean energy, and nuclear is one of those major sources that we see around the world being developed. So I'm looking forward to that, looking forward to a path that people can live and work with, and continuing these discussions with my colleagues. Thank you very much. And with that, I may just exit. Is that all right? Thank you. All right. Thanks very much. Yeah. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
All right. We'll take a breather. Thank you very much, Premier. Good luck. I'm now going to turn it over to Premier of Nova Scotia, the Honourable Tim Houston.
Thank you, Lena. Good afternoon, everyone. I like Blaine's approach to it, actually. But I just want to say, like, look, energy security, a clean grid that's reliable, but that's affordable to Nova Scotians, but to Canadians is kind of at the forefront of everyone's mind. So I enjoyed the discussion today. You know, a lot of work's been done by the team from Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and also the federal team, on making sure we can come up with a plan where we've landed with a modified loop, which focuses on meeting the targets by 2030, but in an affordable way for Nova Scotia. So I think the fact that we're all on the same page on what's possible is really important, and then we move on to the discussions about how do we work together to make sure it's affordable. So, you know, we'll work closely with the federal government, keeping affordability at the front and center of everyone's minds on, you know, what mechanisms may exist. And I think we had broad agreement today on, you know, some of the federal mechanisms that are there in place now will be just fine. There'll be others that we'll try to work together on how we kind of make them a little bit more appropriate for some of the things that we're trying to do. But I think the message is that we share a sense of urgency. We share a commitment to meeting the targets that we both have in place, and we share a sense of commitment to do it in an appropriate way that people can afford. So I enjoyed the discussion, and I appreciate Minister Wilkinson, Minister Fraser, Minister LeBlanc's participation in it. It's good. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm now going to turn it over to Minister Gudie Hutchings, Atlantic Canada's champion at the table, right? Come on over.
Thanks, Lena. It's always great to be with you, Premier Houston and Premier Higgs. Safe travels. Great to be with you always, Jonathan and Sean and my colleagues from New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. Friends, I don't need to tell anybody on this stage, but right now is an incredible time to live and work and make investments in Atlantic Canada. So according to the Public Policy Forum's Atlantic Canada Momentum Index, and man, isn't that a mouthful, more businesses are choosing to invest and innovate in the backyards of Atlantic Canadians than ever before. So friends, we have to be ready. As businesses prioritize access to clean electricity, we know that this is the foundation for their economic successes. And as more people in our region make the switch to heat pumps, access to affordable, reliable, and clean electricity is critical. So today is about working together, as Minister Wilkinson said, and to make sure that we have reliable, renewable energy available across our region, and that we'll be there to help workers and communities as areas that rely on coal make the transition to renewables. So to help New Brunswick transition off coal, the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency, which I'm proud to be Minister of, is investing more than $3 million in 2 projects to help New Brunswick transition from coal to biomass and support businesses who rely on the coal impacts. The first project will help New Brunswick Power transition the Belledune generating station to biomass. And I'm sure you know that Belledune is the last coal-producing power plant in New Brunswick. The project will help the province meet our target of phasing out coal-fired electricity generation by 2030 by providing the data that we need to convert the station to one that burns sustainably sourced biomass. And the nearby Belledune Port Authority relies on coal imports for the power plant, so the second investment will help the port diversify its operations and establish a green industrial hub at the port. This will help northern New Brunswick attract new and innovative industries that will foster job creation. Friends, there are 130 workers who rely on that port and their plant for their livelihood. These investments will help diversify the economy in northern New Brunswick and support these families while preparing for the future. Friends, these are just 2 of the ways that our government is making sure Atlantic Canada is positioned to succeed both today and in the future. So thanks for coming, friends. Lena, back to you.
Well, thank you very much. I don't think I've been at an announcement that was so nicely done. How's that? So as you can see, we have members of parliaments with us from Nova Scotia, from New Brunswick, Minister Tory Rushton from Nova Scotia, of course, our own Minister Sean Fraser, who's the Nova Scotia at the cabinet table. But you know what we're going to do now? We're going to move to questions. And so I think I'm going to pass it over to you. Perfect. Go for it. Let's lead us. So thank you, everybody, and over to you.
Okay, I'm Stephanie Levitz with the Toronto Star. I'll be moderating today's press conference. We'll begin with questions here in the room, and then we'll move to the online portion of questions. If you have a question online, please raise your hand. I can see that. Please also know that if you do not have the right headset, translation will not be provided for your question. For those of us listening, just a bit of a heads up on that. And so we will start here in the room. We have about 20 minutes for questions. And the first question, Mia Rabson, the Canadian Press.
Hi, good afternoon or good evening. I'm wondering if you could explain this idea of a modified Atlantic Loop, what exactly goes into it and who's going to be funding it, and why just a week ago we were talking about no Atlantic Loop at all.
Be appropriate if you do it together.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully Premier Houston and I say the same thing. But so look, the Atlantic Loop, people will recall, was an idea that actually came from Atlantic Canada, and the federal government engaged that conversation. I think a number of things have changed over the past number of years. I think Atlantic Canada and the provinces of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have reassessed their needs and have looked a little bit more towards local generation as one of the ways to resolve some of their challenges with respect to electricity. I think that the amount of electricity that's available from Quebec is perhaps a bit more constrained than people might have thought a few years ago. But it's also the case that as time has ticked by, we have come to the realization that it would be very difficult to complete the Atlantic Loop before 2030, even if we were fully on board with moving that. And therefore, we need plans that will enable both of those provinces to get off coal by 2030. Electricity is an area of provincial responsibility, but the federal government obviously wants to support provinces and territories that are bold and creative in terms of trying to ensure that they have a plan to get off coal. And so we are moving forward with a plan that will look at different forms of generation in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. But part of it in the first phase involves additional transmission links between the two provinces. There is a second phase of discussions that we will be having around the post-2030 period, and that will include a discussion about whether further regional interconnections may well be valuable for a whole range of reasons, including reasons that were different from what generated the idea of the Atlantic Loop in the first place. So it's a modified loop. We're taking a step, part of the loop, and we will be talking about what other elements of the loop may be valuable in that post-2030 conversation.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think when you look at one significant project like the Atlantic Loop as it was contemplated, it's becoming more obvious that to get that done in the time frame that we need to get off coal that's pretty difficult. 2030 is approaching quickly. The cost has ballooned in a significant way. It's just not affordable anymore. So, and I think it would commit, in our case, Nova Scotians, to a single project that could last over 50 years. There just wouldn't be much capital left for other projects. So what we've looked at is we said what's possible, and we've come up with kind of a solution that will get us off coal by 2030. But it's more wind, it's more solar, more things that we can generate in Nova Scotia. And it leaves a lot of flexibility as new technologies come on, as tidal comes on, as nuclear comes on, as hydrogen, green hydrogen becomes an option. We will be able to have the flexibility to adopt those and move with those. So it's really important that we look at a project that's doable, but that maintains flexibility for the province. And so the first, the intertie with New Brunswick would have been part of the loop as contemplated. So it is a step in that direction. Ultimately, I mean, we have such incredible opportunities with wind in Nova Scotia. Our offshore wind speeds are world class. High capacity means they blow a lot. It's very windy offshore, but also onshore. So the wind potential we have is so obvious in what it can do to our economy. And so why I say, in the fullness of time, what was contemplated as the loop that had been a discussion point, those lines may get built out in the fullness of time. They won't get built out by 2030, but ultimately they might, and we'll probably want that so we can export energy to other jurisdictions as well. So today, what we're talking about and what we have an agreement upon is a plan that would see us meet our targets, would green our grid, and there's discussions to be had to make sure that's affordable for sure. We'll continue those discussions, but I would say kind of a necessary part of what was ultimately the full loop. It's still contemplated. That's New Brunswick intertie. So that's the modified part.
So we're not really talking about a loop anymore. We're talking about extending one existing intertie as sort of this modified loop. And do we have a cost estimate for what that would be at this point?
Yeah, I think I would take your point. When the full loop was built, there'd be multiple components, and what we're talking about by 2030, with in partnership with a number of entities, but certainly with New Brunswick and with the federal government, would see a part of that. But just order of magnitude, I think the costing on what would have been the loop, as people would have been thinking about it would be like $8 or $9 billion. Like the costs are really significant, and those aren't by any means fully. I think it's like a class 3 estimate or something. It's the furthest away you can get from an actual hard number. And what we'd be talking about on the intertie portion, some of the other things would be just a little over, between 1 and 2 billion. So order of magnitude, we're talking about something that's almost a quarter of the price, but it allows us, it enables us to meet our targets and still keep options open for the future.
Glenn McGregor, allnovascotia.com.
For Mr. Wilkinson, would you say the loop as envisioned is now dead forever? And what's going to happen to that, what was it, $4.5 billion you had set aside? Is that money going to be reprofiled for these projects? Is it going to be, can you commit to it being spent on energy projects in Atlantic Canada?
So I would say that the loop as it was previously conceived is not something that we are proceeding with. Ultimately, the governments of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia have to be supportive of that. The grids belong to the provinces. It's an area of exclusive provincial jurisdiction. What we have essentially developed is a plan that will enable us to get to the objectives that we were looking to get to with the full-blown Atlantic Loop, which is off coal and a clean grid by 2035, and ultimately a robust grid as we move towards a net zero future by 2050 that will support economic activity in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. But what I would say is the first piece, which was part of the original loop, will be part of the phase 1, and there is going to be conversations around phase 2 about whether other elements of what had been the loop before, whether those will actually proceed. And I mentioned when I answered the earlier question that, the dynamics have changed a little bit. I mean, when the loop was originally conceived, it was felt that Quebec had very abundant amounts of clean energy. And I think Quebec is now increasingly seeing that it is energy constrained and is looking for new sources of generation. Nova Scotia saw itself as an importer of power at that point. I think Nova Scotia increasingly, I don't want to speak for the Premier, but increasingly is looking at itself as potentially a net exporter of power, including potentially to Quebec. And so in phase 2, we will come back to the conversations, and the drivers for some of the parts of the loop that were initially envisioned may be different. And we may end up with something that looks a lot like the previous proposal, but it's in a different phase. So in terms of the money, the way in which this works is you secure funding from your cabinet colleagues as part of a particular project. So that money was actually dedicated to the Atlantic Loop. Much of that money was in the form of low-interest loans. So we are going to be working with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick on a new plan, and we will be bringing to the table all of the funding tools that the federal government has, including funding tools that weren't even on the table when the loop started, including the investment tax credits, which represented an investment over time of $40 to $50 billion in the last budget. So there are significant amounts of supports that the federal government can bring to the table to accelerate the work that Nova Scotia and New Brunswick are doing, and that's essentially what we've committed to do today.
Premier Houston, I mean, this is still a big job, even though it's a modified version of it, much smaller. But are you confident that given some of the issues you've dealt with in terms of like high labor costs in Nova Scotia, that you can still complete this?
Yeah, I think, look, when you look at when you look at the elements of the plan to meet our targets by 2030, sure, there's work to be done. There's no question about that. But I think, and some of those procurements have gone out already for certain elements of the wind part of it. There'll be more to come. But I think in terms of the pricing that we're getting back on the cost to the ratepayer on some of the wind projects are coming in it's incredible. The pricing that we're getting on those much more effective than the cost would have been on the loop. So I think once as long as the economics are there for the proponents, which they are from the initial procurements that we've seen, then I think the projects will get done. Obviously, there's with working with the federal government on some of the like the ITC structure there, some of the loan structures, and some of the other tools that are available to us, we'll make sure. But definitely, we're putting forward as a plan that we believe in. We think it can get done, but we don't think it's going to be easy. We're not doing it because it's easy. We're doing it because it's the right thing to do.
Adam Harris, New Brunswick Telegraph-Journal.
Thanks. I just want to, maybe for Minister Wilkinson, a clarification on, I guess, now the Salisbury to Onslow project. Does that also include to Lopro by 2030? And will that, onto the money point, be available for similar loans from the Infrastructure Bank? And then you talked about tax credits, but beyond that, will there be actual a federal direct investment beyond, I guess, the programs that exist now?
So my understanding is LaPro is included in that project. And certainly the Canada Infrastructure Bank is already actually engaged with Nova Scotia and New Brunswick on this project and having productive conversations. The investment tax credits, obviously they have to be finalized, but my expectation is this project would likely qualify as an interprovincial line. And that is a significant contribution on the part of the federal government. I mean, one of the things that I think perhaps the media did not fully appreciate in the last budget was the amount of money that was actually put in through investment tax credits far exceeds anything that has ever been put into the Strategic Innovation Fund or the Clean Fuels Fund. And it was a decision on the part of the government to essentially put in place mechanisms that could apply to all these kinds of projects in order to accelerate the rate of development and deployment, rather than having companies or utilities applying to the Strategic Innovation Fund and one or two or three actually being successful. So it is essentially a top-up, but we are going to be bringing all of the tools to the table and having conversations with the province. At the end of the day, the grid of the future needs to be one that is clean, but it also needs to be reliable, and it also needs to be affordable.
And just a follow-up, I want to ask specifically about the conversion of the Belledune plant in northern New Brunswick to biomass. Do you think that 2030 timeline is doable? And are you happy with the decision to turn that coal facility into biomass specifically?
So, I mean, New Brunswick would probably be a better place to talk a little bit about the specifics, but I think New Brunswick's plan, and I think we agree with the plan, is that it's doable within the time frame. And sustainably sourced biomass is a net zero fuel, and that is recognized not only in Canada but by international authorities. New Brunswick has a significant amount of residuals that it can actually repurpose for this exact use, and so we see it as actually perhaps one of the easier ways you can make a significant dent in terms of transitioning by going off coal and moving effectively the same facility to biomass. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to now move to the online portion of our question and answer. Again, if you have a question and you're online, please use the raise hand function on Zoom. We'll go first to Michael Gorman with CBC. Go ahead, Michael, you should be unmuted.
Loop, of course, putting aside the cost, was the format of the federal funding and, to the Premier's point, what that would do to power rates. And I'm wondering for you, Premier, if you heard something today from the Minister that assuages your concerns about that when it comes to this approach, and Minister Wilkinson, for you, whether or not you're thinking on how to address the Premier's concerns about what this project could do to power rates has changed your own approach on this issue.
Thanks for the question, Michael. We kind of missed the first part, but I think I got the gist of it. Listen, I think a couple important takeaways from me today, and of course today's meeting followed a meeting we had in Halifax last week with all the federal members, or a group of the federal members from Nova Scotia, where we talked about what's possible. So I think my takeaway today is that, you know, the federal government is, we're on the same page as to what's necessary in terms of meeting the targets in a way that everyone's happy with or content with to pursue. So that's a good thing. I think there's agreement that this is an urgent matter. We need to get going on that. So that's a good thing. And then as we talk about you know, funding and financing and support, all these things, I think there's broad agreement as a starting point that the elements of the plan that we're talking about are elements that, you know, they're consistent with the goals of the federal government, and that are consistent with what would be the thinking behind some of the funding tools that would be there. So we're in agreement with, you know, the broad concepts that these are eligible for funding. Now we just need to, you know, get the teams together to talk about how that actually looks. But look, it's I think Nova Scotians know, and the New Brunswick and the federal government would also be on the same page that these things have to be affordable for the people that have to pay the bills. So we'll talk about you know, the different funding options that are there, and make sure that we'll push as hard as we can for Nova Scotians, I'm sure. But I think there's enough agreement today that I'm optimistic that we can get something done that is to the benefit of Nova Scotians and ultimately to the benefit of Canadians.
Sorry, he had asked. So I think Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and the federal government share common objectives, which is to ensure that as we are building the grid of the future, that it is non-emitting, but it is also reliable and affordable. And there are two ways to approach these kinds of issues from a federal-provincial perspective. One is to essentially throw stones at each other across the federal-provincial fence and not make a lot of progress. The other is to embrace the challenge and to sit down and to try to find pathways through which we can actually get to the objectives that we share. And I want to acknowledge the partnership with Premier Houston and Minister Rushton, Premier Higgs, on sitting down and actually choosing that progressive, thoughtful path. That's how Canada makes progress. And I think that while there certainly will be things that will arise in the course of our conversations where we will not have immediate agreement, having a table at which we actually sit down and try to figure out pathways through which we get to the places that we all want to get to, I think that's the essence of Canada when Canada works well. So I'm very pleased with us launching this today, and I think we can make some good progress for the people who live in Nova Scotia and in New Brunswick.
If I might, Minister Wilkinson, one follow-up for you, given how close 2030 is, and no disrespect, the money you announced today is not even a drop in the bucket compared to what this project is going to cost. How quickly can the federal government mobilize the money that it will take so that the work in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia can be done in time to hit the 2030 targets?
Well, it's a really good question. I would say, look, we're not starting from ground zero. I mean, Nova Scotia has made significant progress in the development of renewable resources, particularly wind-related resources, over the past few years, and the federal government has made some very significant investments in that. I think the Prime Minister made a major announcement last year with respect to investments on the federal side. In terms of mobilizing financial resources, I would say that some of the tools we are in the fortunate position to already have in place. We recapitalized what we call the SREPS program, which is funding for renewables in the last budget. We have a funding program for electricity pre-development work. We have the Canada Infrastructure Bank, which is actually working now on a number of elements of this plan already. And we have the investment tax credits, which need to be finalized over the course of the coming months, but will actually provide broad support to a range of projects across both provinces. And there are other things that we may need to do, but I would say that a lot of the money is actually either in place or it will shortly be to actually have the federal government be a participant in supporting the work that needs to be done.
Alex Villeneuve, Radio-Canada.
Oui, bonjour. For Mr. Wilkinson, regarding all those discussions, the fact that the loop is no longer in play, is there any opening to offer a longer lead time for 2030 for New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, especially because you seem very satisfied about the efforts that they are going? Is it a possibility that for some project, Belgium, for example, we can keep coal for a shorter, a little bit after 2030?
Well, il y a une réglementation.
There is a regulation that states all the provinces and territories have to phase out coal-fired power plants by 2030. Now, of course, New Brunswick and Nova Scotia have plans in place to make sure that they can phase out these coal-fired power plants, and we want to work together on that. And of course, Belgium, for example, is a key part of New Brunswick's plan, and we have to work very quickly, but also work very hard. Exactly.
Dans l'annonce que vous avez fait, deux projets, là, les éoliennes à l'île de Sable et les petits réacteurs nucléaires, est-ce que ça pourrait s'inscrire dans l'annonce d'aujourd'hui?
Well, il y a...
There's lots of conversations about wind power. That's extremely important for Nova Scotia. And of course, there's the on-land wind farms, the onshore ones, but there's also the offshore wind farms. And we're having lots of conversations around this. And of course, the federal government wants to support these efforts being undertaken by Nova Scotia for wind farms to generate electricity and also to produce hydrogen. And now with the small modular nuclear reactors, this is something which is not part of the plan for 2030, but rather for post-2030. New Brunswick thinks it's very important for the future, for their economy, and also for the grid.
I'm informed that Premier Houston and Minister Wilkinson have to go, so that will be, I guess, the end of our question and answer period tonight. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Have a good evening. Bonsoir.
Good evening.